Adam Gottlob Oehlenschläger was a Danish poet and playwright. He introduced romanticism into Danish literature. Biography. He was born in Vesterbro, then a suburb of Copenhagen, on the 14th of November 1779. His father, a Schleswiger by birth, was at the time organist, and later became keeper of the royal palace of Frederiksberg. He was a very brisk and cheerful man. The poet's mother, on the other hand, who was partly German by extraction, suffered from depression, which afterwards deepened into melancholy madness. Oehlenschläger and his sister Sophia were allowed their own way throughout the childhood, and were taught nothing except to read and write, until the 12th year. At the age of 9, Oehlenschläger began to make fluent verses. 3 years later, while walking in Frederiksberg Gardens, he attracted the notice of the poet Edward Storm, and the result of the conversation was that he received a nomination to the college called Posterities High School, an important institution of which Storm was the principal. Storm himself taught the class of Scandinavian mythology, and thus Oehlenschläger received his earliest bias towards the poetical religion of his ancestors. Oehlenschläger was confirmed in 1795, and was to have been apprenticed to a tradesman in Copenhagen. To his great delight there was a hitch in the preliminaries, and he returned to his father's house. He, now in his 18th year, suddenly took up study with great zeal, but soon again abandoned his books for the stage, where he was offered a small position. In 1797 he made his appearance on the boards in several successive parts, but soon discovered that he possessed no real histrionic talent. The brothers Orsted, with whom he had formed an intimacy that proved quite profitable to him, persuaded him to quit the stage, and in 1800 he entered the University of Copenhagen as a student. He was doomed, however, to disturbance in his studies, first from the death of his mother, next from his inveterate tendency towards poetry, and finally from the First Battle of Copenhagen in April 1801, which, however, inspired a dramatic sketch which is the first thing of the kind by Oehlenschläger that we possess. In the summer of 1802, when Oehlenschläger had an old Scandinavian romance, as well as a volume of lyrics, in the press, the young Norse philosopher, Henrik Steffens, came back to Copenhagen after a long visit to Schelling in Germany, full of new romantic ideas. His lectures at the university, in which Goethe and Schiller were revealed to the Danish public for the first time, created a great sensation. Steffens and Oehlenschläger met one day at Dreyer's Club, and after a conversation of 16 hours the latter went home, suppressed his 2 coming volumes, and wrote out of sitting his splendid poem Guldhornin, in a manner totally new to Danish literature. The result of his new enthusiasm speedily showed itself in a somewhat hasty volume of poems, published in 1803, now chiefly remembered as containing the lovely piece called Sankt Hans Aftenspil. The next 2 years saw the production of several exquisite works, in particular the epic of Thor's Restil Jotunheim, the charming poem in hexameters called Langelands Reisen, and a bewitching piece of fantasy Aladdin. At the age of 26, Oehlenschläger was universally recognized, even by the opponents of the Romantic Revival, as the leading poet of Denmark. He now collected his poetical writings in 2 volumes. He found no difficulty in obtaining a grant for foreign travel from the government, and he left his native country for the first time, joining Steffens at Halle in August 1805. Here he wrote the first of his great historical tragedies, Hakan Jarl, which he sent off to Copenhagen, and then proceeded for the winter months to Berlin, where he associated with Humboldt, Fichte, and the leading men of the day, and met Goethe for the first time. In the spring of 1806 he went on to Weimar, where he spent several months in daily intercourse with Goethe. The autumn of the same year he spent with Tieck in Dresden, and proceeded in December to Paris. Here he resided 18 months and wrote his three famous masterpieces, Baldurhingode, Palnatoke, and Axel og Valborg. Oehlenschläger had also made his own translation of Aladdin into German, adding some extra new material which does not appear in the 1805 edition. This revised version was published in Amsterdam in 1808. Ferruccio Busoni later used the text of this translation for the last movement of his piano concerto Op. 39. Later editions of Oehlenschläger's play do not contain this text. In July 1808 he left Paris and spent the autumn and winter in Switzerland as the guest of Madame de Staël at Coppet, in the midst of her circle of wits. In the spring of 1809 Oehlenschläger went to Rome to visit Bertel Thorvaldsen, and in his house wrote his tragedy of Correggio. He hurriedly returned to Denmark in the spring of 1810, partly to take the chair of aesthetics at the University of Copenhagen, partly to marry the sister-in-law of Rabeck, to whom he had been long betrothed. His first course of lectures dealt with his Danish predecessor Johannes Ewald II with Schiller. For this time forward his literary activity became very great. In 1811 he published the Oriental Tale of Ali og Galinde, and in 1812 the last of his great tragedies, Stærkodder. From 1814 to 1819 he, or rather his admirers, were engaged in a long and angry controversy with Baggesen, who represented the old didactic school. This contest seems to have disturbed the peace of Oehlenschläger's mind and to have undermined his genius. His talent may be said to have culminated in the glorious cycle of verse romances called Helga, published in 1814. The tragedy of Hagbarth og Signe showed a distinct falling off in style. In 1817 he went back to Paris, and published Rådsaga and the tragedy of Fosterbrødrene. In 1818 he was again in Copenhagen, and wrote the idyll of Den lille Heidedreng and the Edaic cycle called Nordens Guder. His next productions were the tragedies of Erik og Abel and Væringen I Miklegard, and the epic of Hrolf Krag. His last volumes were Tordens Jold, Dronning Margrethe, Socrates, Olaf den Hellige, Knud den Store, Dina, Erik Glipping, and Kjartan og Gudrun. On his 70th birthday, the 14th of November 1849, a public festival was arranged in his honor, and he was decorated by the King of Denmark under circumstances of great pomp. He died on the 20th of January 1850 and was buried in the cemetery of Frederiksberg. Immediately after his death his recollections were published in 2 volumes. Legacy. With the exception of Ludvig Holberg, no Danish writer before 1870 has exercised so wide an influence as Oehlenschläger. His great work was to awaken in the breasts of his countrymen an enthusiasm for the poetry and religion of their ancestors, and this he performed to so complete an extent that his name remains to this day synonymous with Scandinavian romance. He supplied his countrymen with romantic tragedy at the very moment when all eyes were turned to the stage, and when the old-fashioned pieces were felt to be inadequate. His plays, partly no doubt in consequence of his own early familiarity with acting, fulfilled the stage requirements of the day, and were popular beyond all expectation. The earliest to the best, Oehlenschläger's dramatic masterpiece being, without doubt, his first tragedy, Hakan Jarl. In his poems and plays alike, his style is limpid, elevated, profuse. His flight is sustained at a high pitch without visible excitement. His fluent tenderness and romantic zest have been the secrets of his extreme popularity. Although his inspiration came from Germany, he is not much like a German poet, except when he is consciously following Goethe. His analogy is rather to be found among English poets than his contemporaries. His mission towards antiquity reminds us of Scott. He sometimes has touches of exquisite diction and of overwrought sensibility which recall Coleridge. In his wide ambition and profuseness he possesses some characteristics of Robert Southey, although his style has far more vitality. With all his faults, he was a very great writer, and one of the principal pioneers of the Romantic movement in Europe. In 1829 he was publicly crowned with laurel as the King of Nordic Poetry, and the Scandinavian King of Song, in the Cathedral of Lund, Sweden. Based on a vast production of poetry, theatre plays and prose, inspired by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Gottlieb Fichte, and Friedrich von Schelling, he wrote the song Der Erwyndigt Land, which is now the national anthem of Denmark.